This ruled as high priest, and the problem is that he is installed by Rome. Before this, the high priest was chosen as who God wanted. And so because this was a political installation, the Pharisees were insulted. They said the whole system had been corrupted, and they withdrew support from the Sadducees. So John Hyrcanus is a Sadducee, and the Sadducees are more politically oriented. Rome grows in power. It's like meanwhile back at the ranch, Rome is growing, and Pompey possesses Jerusalem. Pompey, the Roman general, possesses Jerusalem in 63 BCE. And they are left until 40 BC under native rulers. In 40 BCE, Julius Caesar is assassinated in the Roman Senate, and Octavian and Antony Cleopatra, that pair, really both of them a piece of work, vied for power. Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra and became the first emperor. Octavian ruled from 37 to 4 BCE, and he changed his name to Caesar Augustus in 31 BCE, which means Caesar, the manifest of God. He was humble. Just joking. Augustus placed the Jews under Herod I, who was an Idumean, that is, he is a descendant of ancient Edom. So Herod was paranoid, ruthless, power-hungry, and he killed anyone he thought would be a threat to his power. So he killed 2 of his 10 wives, 3 of his own sons, his brother-in-law, and his wife's grandfather. And he was so hated that at his death he wanted to have someone mourning, even though they weren't mourning for him. So he ordered that the leaders of Jericho be held in a stadium, and at his death he ordered that they be killed, so that when he died, someone would be grieving even though it wasn't for him. Of course, when he did die, they actually just released the leaders of Jericho. They didn't actually kill them. Herod did do some good things. He expanded the second temple to its glorious state during the life of Christ. He died in 4 BCE, and Jesus is actually born before he died. Most scholars estimate Jesus was born around 8 BCE. Now, I know there's an obvious problem there, because you would think that Jesus would be born in 1 AD, but in fact, they did the calendar wrong, counting backwards, not accounting for things like leap years, and so the monk who set up our current calendar didn't quite do it right. After Herod's death, the kingdom was divided between his 3 sons. That is, not the Roman Empire, but the kingdom of Israel. So Archelaus ruled in southern Palestine, but he was a very brutal ruler, and he was banished after 9 years. And then Pontius Pilate was appointed Roman governor in his place. Philip ruled over northern Palestine, and Herod Antipas ruled over the home area of Jesus, which is Galilee, and that's important to New Testament studies. I mentioned the Pharisees and Sadducees handout in the folder for this week. That's all stuff for Exam 1, so you should take a look at that. I won't go over all those details in the lecture, but you can read them. The Essenes are not really mentioned in the New Testament, but they were probably the group that preserved what we know now as the Dead Sea Scrolls in the area of Qumran. So they are important because they have preserved really ancient manuscripts of the Old Testament that we look at today. The Herodians were people who supported Herod. So it would be like saying someone who supported President Reagan was a Reaganite, or somebody who supported President Clinton was a Clintonite. The Zealots were people who advocated the overthrow of the Roman Empire, or the Roman rule in Israel, by force. Scribes or rabbis, which are also mentioned in the New Testament, are the people who were copiers. That is, they made new copies of the scrolls of Scripture and the law, and they're also guardians of the law of that day. Common people made up 90% of the populace, and the religious groups absolutely despised them, and Jesus ministers to these people, and that's one of the controversial things about, the scandalous things about Jesus' ministry. In places of worship, there were the temple where sacrifices were made, and then the synagogue. And it's like an ancient church or community center. The name actually means congregation or assembly. The origin is probably during the Babylonian and Persian exile, and it's thought that they were developed to help preserve Jewish culture when they were actually not living in Israel. So they could teach their children and remind the adults about where they came from and what they were all about. In any case, they were ubiquitous by 480 BCE. They were used for Sabbath worship, for the instruction of children in basic subjects like reading, writing, and mathematics. Most towns actually had one. Only 10 men were required to set up a synagogue. 3 kinds of officers for the synagogue that are, well, maybe of minor importance for this study. A study of the New Testament. There's a ruler, who I think his name is obvious. He was over the whole thing and the administration of it. A Hassan, or attendant, was responsible for actually being sure the scrolls were rolled out to the right place for the reading that week. And then there is the messenger. Worship elements look something like a modern church service. First, they had the reading of the Shema, which is the Hebrew word for here. That's Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9. That is even read today in modern synagogue services. There was a prayer, a reading of the law for that day, whatever portion was designated, a sermon by a rabbi, which was some lesson on the law, and finally they allowed a time for individuals to address the congregation. We'll see later in New Testament studies that the Apostle Paul actually took advantage of this time to speak to the people about Jesus.